There is first fire, then earth, then air, then water. So the unfolding of consciousness as it expresses and experiences itself and experiences the universe happens in that order. Fire, earth, air, water. And so we can see this manifesting on the zodiac wheel, starting with Aries, going to Taurus, going to Gemini, and then Cancer. However, incarnation is another matter. And incarnation is something that is revealed through the process of the unfolding tarot from card to card. And you can see it's quite a miraculous perfection that's unfolding. And one of the images that I sent you is entitled The Blossom of Incarnation. And this actually shows visually what's going on in the cycle of manifestation, the cycle of incarnation, from one sign to another. So what's actually occurring is an ascending spiral pattern. It begins with fire. It begins with the nature of Aries. It's the spark of creation. It's the very first burst. It can be likened to the Big Bang. It then moves and evolves itself, remaining in fire, over to Leo, then over to Sagittarius. And then after Sagittarius, it comes to the full fruition of the wisdom that is inherent in that element, and then moves on to the next element. So we'll go over exactly how that unfolds and how that actually mirrors the cosmological story of the universe, starting with the Big Bang and moving through, all the varying levels of existence, heating and cooling and the organization of matter until the emergence of life. Now this is really fascinating. There are, major stages that the field of science has established for the unfolding of the evolution of the universe, starting with the Big Bang. And these correspond quite beautifully to the way the astrological influences manifest in consecutive order according to the way the tarot is lined up. So the way the tarot works is it moves from the 1 to the 10. It's really amazing the way that the scientific story of things matches with the way that consciousness moves through the expressions embodied by each of these signs. I guess the best way is just to jump right into it and start at the beginning. Well, I'll say first off, the way we have to go from fire to earth to air to water. And so there has to be a maturation that occurs in each element before it can move on to the next. There's the spark that becomes the flame, that becomes the fire, that then cools down and becomes solid matter. All of the trace elements and all of the metals are created. And that's the same way that you move from the fire element to the earth, that then builds and crystallizes and grows into forms that eventually become planets. Gases are then released from the fire and earth combining, that creates the air, and then the weather patterns are created, which results in rain, and then therefore life. So the way this lines up is fascinating. 13.7 billion years ago was the Big Bang, and then that resulted in quarks and nuclei and atomic structures, and the creation of cosmic microwave background radiation just 380,000 years later. And this whole process is embodied beautifully by Aries, the spark of consciousness that explodes outward. The way Aries moves is very much like that. It's raw, primordial energy without any consideration for what else there is. It just explodes out into being. So the spark of any idea moves in the same way. It just, an idea takes seed and it explodes out into realization, into epiphany, and into manifestation. Aries is all about this process, and this matches beautifully with the very first step in the unfolding of the universal story, 13.7 billion years ago. And then 13.3 billion years ago, there were the first generations of stars. As all of this matter that had expanded out from the singularity begins to, due to the gravitational process, it begins to localize. And just huge energies come clashing together and nucleosynthesis begins to occur. And it all gets really hot and eventually becomes what we understand now as suns, and ultimately the creation of the basic elements, hydrogen, helium, carbon, etc. And this is embodied beautifully by Leo, the process of energy localizing. Attention becomes turned inwards, towards the core, towards the self, and then the creative process begins from the core, creating the most basic steps on the elemental periodic table. So that's Leo in a nutshell. And then what happens much later, let's see, it was about 4.6 billion years ago, were the first supernovae, the first exploding stars. And this explosion process actually created the entire periodic table of elements that we know today. All of the trace elements, all of the metals, including gold, were created in the first exploding stars. And this is embodied beautifully by Sagittarius, through which pretty much exactly that is occurring and unfolding. The expansion of the periodic table, the expansion of what is possible through the explosion, through the sharing, the off-gassing, the pouring out in all directions, the massive expansion of what energy used to be localized in the stage of Leo 13.3 billion years ago. So then everything cools down. This matter is sent flying in all different directions and begins to collide with itself in the age of Taurus. And gravitational accumulation, matter consolidation, all of this is absolutely what Taurus is all about. So in the age of Taurus, we saw the first protoplanetary disks of matter, what would eventually become solar systems, and then the gravitational fields first acting on each other, and the friction that takes place between those is so indicative of the very nature of Taurus, which is seeking that friction, seeking the vibration and the sensory experience, which first started coming into being at that time about 4.6 billion years ago. And then in the age of Virgo, about 4.5 billion years ago, then there was the organization of matter and the creation of planetary bodies. So in order for a planet to emerge from just these protoplanetary disks, it's a very long and tedious process of things smashing into each other. It ends up taking a really, really long time, and this complex process is perfect for Virgo. It is exactly what Virgo is all about, the organization of matter and everything going into its right place, and ultimately the creation of planetary bodies from which life can spring. And so then there was also something that reflects beautifully the Virgo's nature to heal, everything becoming spherical, going from just chaotic clusters to these really nice functional orbs that revolve around each other. And then that moved into the age of Capricorn, where the distribution of celestial objects according to gravitational hierarchies and whatever assigned gravity there is to each particular star that all of this matter revolves around, that's perfect for Capricorn, the development of solar systems. They are the creators of systems, all kinds of functional systems. That's very Capricornian, and that happened 4.4 billion years ago, with the creation of the first solar systems. And then after that, Gemini, this is the first emergence of air. The first air, as we experience it today on the planet, emerged from fire and earth coming together, releasing gases, vapors and gas expelled from planetary interiors, which formed ultimately atmospheres. And it was at this point that the very beginning of weather patterns were occurring, but it was highly chaotic. There was a lot going on. This was a time that objects were still falling rapidly from the sky, changing everything up, changing the different layers of pressure in the atmosphere. There was nothing stable about any of it. It was all just jumbling back and forth, and I imagine weather, whatever version or form of weather they had at that time, was extremely chaotic and highly active. And definitely I could imagine, due to the differences in pressure in the atmosphere, there was just lightning everywhere constantly. It would be just an absolute nightmare for any life attempting to live there. It's completely impossible. But it happens to match perfectly with the nature of Gemini. Very rapid, very electric, and it fits quite perfectly, especially when you consider that the next step would be Libra, the balancing point, when stable atmospheres and stable weather patterns are created. And this was what is known as the Hadean Eon, 3.8 billion years ago. So this was atmospheric pressure variations giving rise to balance of hemispheric weather patterns. So this would be like we experience today. This would have been established 3.8 billion years ago. The air in the northern hemisphere moves relatively unidirectionally opposed to the southern hemisphere, and that is a perfect reflection of the way that Libra works. The Libra is embodied by the scales, the balancing tool. So that there is just beautiful. And then you consider the next step goes right into the water bearer. Ultimately, what happened then, 3.6 billion years ago, was atmospheric stabilization and the first appearance of oxygen on Earth and the first liquid rain falling to the bare rock beneath. And Aquarius is the water bearer. It's an absolute perfect match. And it's just really amazing. And then Cancer, this is what gave rise to a biogenesis in the first oceans 3.5 billion years ago in the Cambrian Age until about 488 million years ago. This is the evolution of the emergence of consciousness, the primordial soup giving rise to the first organisms that had no free will, no ability to govern themselves, just flowing freely like jellyfish in the waves. An absolute beautiful match for Cancer. And there's just something so raw and vulnerable and something so precious about it that's such a perfect match. And the incubator is sort of what Cancer is all about. It's embodied beautifully by the incubator, a space that a young organism can thrive in. It just maintains the perfect conditions. So that really whatever life forms evolved from these initial points would have never, from that point on, experienced more perfect conditions for the rise of life than those first years, 3.5 billion years ago. And then we move on to the age of Scorpio, a very turbulent period where there are waves of mass extinction. Beginning 439 million years ago, where biological specialization began to occur, and life began to extend itself into every orifice of Earth, evolving and adapting. The process of evolution and change and survival of the fittest and all of these things, and natural selection. This is a perfect match for Scorpio. It really couldn't. I couldn't place Scorpio anywhere else, and I couldn't place anywhere else in this space. Waves of mass extinction that lasted a very long time, until about 7 million years ago, in the rise of humanity, which matches perfectly with the age of Pisces, which embodies so beautifully our uncertain future. Do we get ourselves out of the way of the world, so where we allow the world to thrive and we stop dominating it? Do we merge with life? Do we allow ourselves to synergize, or do we get ourselves out of the way in the way that we don't survive so the world does? These kinds of questions are perfect for Pisces. And Pisces is, of course, the point at which the downward spiral occurs, and it begins again. Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. This is a constant cycle. I remember one book, I forgot the author, a supposed astrologer so mistakenly said that something to the effect of Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces are the most highly evolved of the zodiac. And then she left it at that. And that's such a huge mistake to say that, because it really undermines the whole process of evolution as a whole. But it's so mistaken in the way that, yes, Sagittarius is the highest expression of fire, but fire is only the first step in the unfolding of consciousness as it awakens from the void. And then, yes, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces are the maturing point of each of those elements, but they just lead right into the next. The very nature of Pisces is that it sort of dwindles down to a new beginning, which is where Aries can take form again. And there is no way that anyone could ever speculate, or maybe they would try, but it would be completely invalid to speculate that you can place someone's personal evolution according to one's personal astrology. It just doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, you have somebody who's in Pisces, which is the last. You have somebody in Aries who's the first expression. Even in this unfolding of the evolution and the process of consciousness evolving through the elements. Even in that, it wouldn't be accurate to say that the Pisces is more evolved than the Aries, because who knows how many cycles around any particular person has been when compared to another. But really, when did it all begin, and when will it end, and is there really... I mean, do we not have a common beginning? So all of these questions have to be asked, which this author failed to do. So I have to say that because I know that a lot of people delving into astrology for themselves will come across a lot of information like this, exactly like this, what I just described. And it's good for anyone as a beginner to have this in mind, that there are factors, just speculations into the very nature of reality that may be so biased and so personal and so skewed and distorted that you're going to get information that is completely not accurate, not true to the wisdom that is inherent in unaltered astrology. And unaltered astrology, according to tarot, is probably the best way to do it. Tarot has a natural way of unfolding that just really tells the story of all life themes, which is why it works. It really covers every potential life theme. And when you randomize the tarot by shuffling the cards, for example, you can call upon insight into any life theme. It covers the entire story. And so the way that I'm going to cover tarot is in story form. So the way that I've covered astrology here is by looking at the cosmological story and how that compares with each stage. But what this also gives you is a framework for the way that tarot is arranged, because it's arranged in the same way. The suit of fire, for example, you move from Aries to Leo to Sagittarius in the 1 through the 10. The first, or the ace of each suit, and you have wands, swords, or we'll just do it in order. You have wands, which is fire, and then you have pentacles or discs, which is earth. You have swords, which is air, and cups, which is water. And each one of these unfolds according to the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life, moving from 1 to 2 in numerical order like that. Well, I'll cover what I have here step by step. This is the unfolding of consciousness through astrology according to the tarot. I'm going to describe what occurs in each astrological sign that then moves it on to the next. In the very beginning, with the Ace of Wands, we have the primordial energy, and so that's fire. The Ace of Wands simply means all of fire, the nature of fire itself, and similarly with the Ace of Cups, the Ace of Swords, and so on. But then the 2 is where astrology comes into being. This is when Aries springs forth, this actualization of potentials. So Aries then endures what I call experiential aspects, which are then embodied by each card. The first of which, and they can all be summed up by planetary influences, is Mars. And then the Sun, and then Venus. So that manifests as the 2 of Wands, the 3 of Wands, and the 4 of Wands. That'll give you an example. But I'm just going to go through each one and describe the dynamic at play in moving from one sign to the next as consciousness evolves through forms. Through Aries, consciousness experiences dominion, then virtue, then completion. So that is applied power and courage, number 1, then power and determination, loyalty to the mission, and then action. And the action then resulting in a good start or the completion of the first step. That's the dynamic at play. And then moving on to Leo, Leo experiences strife, victory, then valor. So strife is just another word for drama, and then victory is achievement and pride, which is where a potential for an egocentric nature can come about. But then that moves into maturity at the valor level, which is where they discover their position worth maintaining, who they truly are, and inherent in that process is their creative power. When they get through the drama and through their sense of pride, then they have true potential to make lasting change come about. And then Sagittarius experiences swiftness, strength, oppression. Swiftness is just the experience of sudden release. That's like the supernova experience. Strength is just optimism. Their strength is looking for the bright side of things, looking for the solution to any problem. And then oppression is just the self-exhaustion that they feel from having, just released so much, and from being so optimistic despite the reality of situations, and despite the way life unfolds, they experience self-exhaustion. They exhaust themselves. Or they experience oppression from those who do not receive them the way they intend. And ultimately they experience oppression because they oftentimes are more freedom-loving than the world can allow for. Okay, so then Taurus. Taurus experiences worry, success, and then failure. So in the worry stage, that's like the dark night of the soul. That's the somber and melancholy nature. That's what they experience in the first stages of the unfoldment of Taurus. And then there's success, which is wealth usually through not only the accumulation of wealth, like monetary gain or resources, but also the sharing. And the sharing is absolutely critical because that's going to determine the way in which the next step unfolds, the failure stage. Do they resist it, or do they allow it? Do they resist the sharing inclinations they have, or do they allow it to unfold? And sometimes this also can manifest as just weighing the pros and cons of taking a chance or gambling. Do I keep what I have and risk nothing and then never gain anymore, just keeping what I have, allowing no flow to go through, allowing none to be released so more can come in? Do I keep this, or do I risk it all to attain more by allowing it to flow through? So these are the questions that are inherent in that last step, failure, Taurus. So then Virgo experiences prudence, gain, and wealth. So prudence is that tedious work. This is wisdom and satisfaction, and healing also occurs after the tedious work. So it's the first step that defines the second step. The tedious work defines the way in which the wisdom unfolds, and the nature of the satisfaction and the nature of healing that occurs in the next step, which is gain. So what kind of work they endure is going to determine what they gain. And then lastly is wealth. And this is not like just pure accumulation. This is the point at which wealth gets passed on, where it was the question before. Now this is the given. The Taurus got to the point where it had to ask the question, do I allow it to flow, or do I keep what I have? But the Virgo, inevitably at the stage it gets to in the wealth, is passing that on. That's the service side of things, the service-oriented nature of Virgo. And then moving on to Capricorn, you have the three themes: change, works, and power. In change, there is indecisiveness, and then after that indecisiveness, there's the mastery and persistence that occurs in the works stage, and then after that is power. So the question they must ask is, what kind of change are they willing to accept, and can they make that change occur? And this is inevitably what results in the establishment of systems that allow for the final stage to unfold through power, through monetary accumulation, and through establishing self-perpetuating wealth. And wealth can have many forms, but often with these earth signs, it manifests as physical monetary wealth or resources. And then in Gemini experiences interference, cruelty, and then ruin. So that sounds pretty bad, but it actually isn't, because it's entirely transitional. These aren't consistent states of being. They're not permanent states of being. Transitional, transient. So in interference, this is self-imposed restriction. This is that jumping back and forth that Gemini tends to do, self-imposed restriction in the way that it never consistently is loyal to one particular pole on a spectrum. But then that leads ultimately to a sense of cruelty. Cruelty, the way that the tarot describes cruelty is resisting the inner world. So this is either someone resisting the fact that you have a soul, the fact that you feel, and being cruel to you, or it's the individual resisting their own individual world. And so in the case of Gemini, resisting the inner world, their own inner world, is the form of cruelty that occurs. And then ultimately after that, they break through into humility. So self-imposed restriction, resisting the inner world, and then humility. So there's the indecisive jumbling back and forth that is so maybe superficial or transient or transitional, fickle, all of the things, all of the negative things that could be assigned to Gemini, but that all becomes compensated for when humility is gained. So if humility is gained early on, the other ones can be modified in their transitional nature can be increased. They have to spend less time experienced in order to result in the desired end. So then Libra experiences peace, sorrow, then truce. Peace is a temporary peace. It's a stalemate, stagnation. This is not a long-lasting peace. This is transitional, since these are air signs we're going into. Transitional peace. So what is transitional peace then? It implies that there is not peace before or after. That's one of the things you have to take into consideration when considering this first step. It's temporary, and so maintenance of balance is required. And in order for that to occur, the next step has to occur, sorrow. This is necessary pain. This is coming out of the temporary peace and understanding that it is actually transitional. And then ultimately what happens after that is truce, balancing, healing, and resting. So it's all about seeking balance. There's stagnation in the beginning that seems like peace, and then it moves out of peace, and you discover what it is, discover that there's a need to balance, and then the balance occurs. And then lastly, for the air is Aquarius, and that experiences defeat, science, and futility. Now, in defeat, this is usually unethical action. Now, this can be the unethical action that they perceive in the world, which is requiring grand reforms and new ideas and new ways of thinking and looking at things. Or this is their own unethical action due to the fact that they don't necessarily understand the ramifications of being the way that they are, of being so impersonal, being so aloof, being so withdrawn from human emotion. They may not understand what they're doing, and what may ensue is unethical action. And then in science, they triumph over that the emotional ramifications through psychological problem solving. So this can be the point at which the person sees exactly the new way of doing things needs to be initiated or implemented into the world, the grand idea that will fix something. Or this on the dark side is withdrawing from their own emotions, mastering their own emotions by sort of inflicting psychological constructs onto them, allowing them to efficiently repress their own emotions so they can simply do what needs to be done. But hopefully the former is the manifestation. This can be the point at which grand epiphanies of any kind of design can come about. What that then results in, though, is futility, the point at which they feel that they have to do it themselves, and they have to do it without making their own connections. And that is futile. They can't actually initiate grand change on a grand level without first understanding what's occurring on an intimate level. To really understand themselves is the only way to make change in the world occur. So that's the chain of experience they face in their evolution between forms: defeat, science, futility. And then ultimately that leads to, lastly, the water stage, which is the point at which consciousness registers emotionally, and consciousness takes its full shape, its full spherical shape, where it's not missing anything, it's not transitional anymore, it is what it is. And that first happens through Cancer, through love, abundance, and luxury. So in the love stage, this is respect for another, recognizing that, oh, there is someone there. This is when love first emerges, through empathy and through compassion. And then abundance comes as the response to that. And this often manifests as a love for family. Bring on more of the intimate connections. That's what Cancer experiences is a desire for more of that, more recognition of the value of that person, and more of a consistent and solid and loyal connection to these people. Long-term connections are the most important to them. Husband, wife, mother, father, children. And then the celebration of all of that. That's all inherent to this abundance stage. But then it goes a little sour when they start to hold on too much in the luxury stage. Luxury, in tarot terms, is luxury in excessive amounts. So the Cancer can hold on to certain things that can maybe be like, what's the word, a little too sentimental, to where they're missing the value of what's happening right then and there. This can be holding on to the way something used to be, which can leave them feeling quite sad. Holding on to someone who is not willing to be in that kind of dynamic can result in a kind of sad experience. So the holding on can be the point at which Cancer then sort of experiences the other spectrum, the other side of the spectrum of what it means to be conscious. The sadness that there is love, and yes, there is a reward for having compassion, and yes, family and intimate relationships are blissful and can be, but there are downsides there. There is loss, there is death, there is the reality of time, and there are plenty of reasons to be sad within that. And Cancer, being a very movable sign, obviously feels that. Moving on then to Scorpio. Scorpio experiences disappointment, pleasure, and debacle. So it starts with the shadow, disappointment. Scorpio confronts the shadow and is disappointed. Disappointed in other people, disappointed in the universe, disappointed in God, disappointed in the self, anything. It can really be absolutely anything. And this also manifests as disappointing other people, because other people will fall in love with their potential because they see it radiates, and they're very intense people, very passionate, and oftentimes, brilliance can shine through them that people will be drawn to. But the reality then will hit people, and they'll realize that this person hasn't sorted out anything yet. And so this can result in, like I mentioned before, the low vibrational Scorpio or the higher vibrational Scorpio, where they become just a slave to their desires, or they transcend their desires and move into states of brilliance that can't even be described. So, and that happens, that process is described beautifully by the pleasure section. There's disappointment, pleasure, and debauch. And pleasure that's the point at which they transcend, but they also realize the grand nature of themselves, the grand nature of the universe. And this is when the mysteries are beginning to be solved. This is just like the ultimate deep epiphany, the ultimate deep aha moment, where everything starts clicking. And the occult is actually just the subject of the occult is assigned to Scorpio for this reason. The the reality that they can actually move through the darkness, and they have a chance to. They have a chance to actually confront their own darkness just due to their simple natural inclinations to gravitate towards the shadow. They have the chance of reaching these transcendent states, and that's what the occult provides, a means to reach these transcendent states or transcendent levels of understanding. But then that moves into the final stage, the debauch, and this is when temptation and envy comes into the equation, and obsession and focus and all of these other dark sides of Scorpio. That's when it all comes back around. So it's the revisiting shadow. That we are human beings, and though the Scorpio can't experience these transcendent states, there will be those reminders bringing them back down and grounding them. And this happens just due to their very intensely feeling nature. It's true that through the holding on process that Cancer experiences, they experience in incredibly intense states of sadness and grief and so on, but also the positive side. But it is probably more so for the Scorpio, because they feel it so intensely and so deeply. They've gone to such a deep place within themselves that, they become so flooded that they've gotten so deep that their well is so deep that there's more room to flood. So that's more intense feeling to transpire, either for good or bad, or not bad, but positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant. And so this can manifest as an obsessive nature, maybe vindictive nature, envious nature, and a vengeful nature sometimes, just because they can't escape that intense feeling. So that's a shadow of the shadow that occurred initially, which is, the disappointment that occurred. This is revisiting that. But then that ultimately is transcended as the consciousness emerges beyond that into Pisces, when the Pisces then realizes that it's time to spiral back down. So, and that happens through indolence, happiness, and satiety. So in the indolence, there is laziness, avoidance. This is, okay, it's time to settle down. It's time to spiral back down. And hence the downward spiral nature of Pisces. And then there's contentment and relaxation. Indolence, and then happiness is sort of, I guess it's not like a transcendent joy per se. It's not necessarily the bliss that comes from having transcended something or having broken through. This is just general satisfaction. It's like a general sense of everything's going well. Like, now you can relax. And then what then happens is satiety, being full. Fullness, but possibly to excess. And this is where the addiction tendencies can come into play, where they just in their very nature, in their wiring, they gravitate towards fullness and being excessively full. So overeating, overdrinking, moving towards drugs, maybe to excessive amounts, to destructive amounts, that can come into play there. It can also come into play through the indolence, through laziness or avoidance, avoiding reality, escaping reality. But contentment and relaxation really is the driving force. And ideally, it's a pleasant downward spiral back down to Aries again for another cycle. So, okay, I think I covered that, both the cosmological cycle that reflects in that order and also the experiential aspects according to the tarot.